Hello and welcome to Type 1 Planet, where we explore what a technologically advanced global civilization would need to look like in order to thrive sustainably for thousands of years. And in today's world of exponential technology, one of the most powerful forces shaping our society is undoubtedly social media. These are massive companies like Facebook, Twitter, or now X, and TikTok that now connect billions of people in ways that were unimaginable even a decade ago. And yet, as these platforms have grown, it's become clear that they can also amplify the worst in human discourse. Things like extremism, conspiracies, and outrage that spread faster and farther than ever before, leading to real instability in our foundational institutions that allow structures like democracy to even exist. So to make sense of this complicated landscape, we're joined today by Tobias Rose-Stockwell. He's the author of the acclaimed book, The Outrage Machine, How Social Media Disrupts Civil Society. And I had the pleasure of listening to this book on Audible. It comes with a PDF on Audible that has a lot of incredible graphs and graphics and diagrams that Tobias created for this book. So I highly advise getting the physical copy as well as listening to it, which my physical copy is in the mail right now. And Tobias is a leading thinker and researcher in this space, and his insights on social media cuts to the core of the challenges that we're going to be facing. It's not just in journalism, it's not just in democracy, but actually in civilization itself. So in our discussion today, first we define a lot of key concepts that are used to understanding this issue, things like the Dark Valley and Moloch. And then by establishing these conceptual frameworks, we can dig deep into the questions that are fundamental to understanding the long-term prospects of an advanced global civilization. How did social media become what it is today? What are the incentives that drive its worst outcomes? And most importantly, how can we create social technologies that bring out the best in humankind rather than the worst? So I'm really thrilled about this conversation. Tobias is an amazingly articulate person in this space, and he makes very complex ideas seem simple and understandable, which I really appreciated. So I hope you enjoy it. If you have any feedback or questions or suggestions, please contact us at Type 1 Planet on social media, or type1planet.net is our website. Looking forward to hearing from you, and enjoy. Hello and welcome to Type 1 Planet, where we are making a working model of what a global civilization would need to look like in order to sustainably thrive for thousands of years into the future. And today we're exploring systems of mass instant communication, specifically social media, how they've arisen on our planet the last couple of decades, to talk about their design, how human beings engage with them, and what they're doing to the structure of our civilization. So, Tobias, thank you so much for joining us and bringing your wealth of experiences and ideas to this very complicated topic.
Thanks so much for having me, Robert. I really appreciate it.
So I read your book, Outrage Machine, How Tech Amplifies Discontent, Disrupts Democracy, and What We Can Do About It. And I don't have a copy because I listened to it. Very good audiobook, but you do if you wanted to hold it up quickly, and I'll, perfect. It's an awesome book. The only thing that was difficult about not having it is in my hand is because of all the incredible diagrams and visuals that Tobias, you created for this book. In the audiobook, there is a PDF, which I was able to use, but I'm going to get my hands on a physical copy too. It looks like it's beautiful.
Awesome.
And so today I'd like to begin. We're going to kind of go through many of these concepts in this book, and I'd like to begin today with a little bit of definition and sense making around human psychology and behavior. And one of the, human behavior and psychology powers everything that we're going to be talking about today. So this is going to be an important first step. Let's talk about first a concept that comes from Richard Dawkins that you mentioned that is going to be very important to the structure of social media, which is memes, which is applying an evolutionary theory to ideas. So from your perspective, why did you bring the concept of a meme? Like, what is a meme and why was it important? And how has the behavior of memes changed in the last couple of decades?
So yeah, memes are this really kind of fascinating idea that was developed initially by Richard Dawkins back in the 1970s in his famous book, The Selfish Gene, in which he found and made this very kind of a compelling case for the ideas of the primary unit of information in species of life being genes, being single, units of genetic information that are trying to replicate themselves and make themselves more plentiful in the world, and that we as living creatures are primarily vehicles for genetic propagation. It was a very compelling book, very influential book, but he had this kind of subtext in the book, this small little aside in the book, in which he postulated that while genes, which are very definable and kind of seeable, right? We can really see genes in our DNA, and we can see the lines of code that are in our DNA. He postulated that it's possible that we also that memes, being cultural information, might transit in the same way as genetic information, so that we might actually be carrying little bits of self-replicating code in the form of memetics, in the form of memes, that are trying to reproduce themselves in our minds as opposed to in our bodies and through our bodies. So it was a kind of a nifty thought experiment that he was embarking on as a subtext of this very important work on genes. But it turned out to be a very prescient and important way of thinking about information and ideas in our culture. So this is entered into the common lexicon of our discourse through, we think about a meme, we think about a funny little image with some text on it that has some kind of funny truth to it, or some kind of biting commentary about the world. But on their own, any unit of cultural information can promulgate and transit across our species, and is looking for ways to replicate across our species, much like a gene would. A jingle from a cereal commercial back when you were a kid, they got stuck in your head like a little kind of just running over and over again in your head. That was something that you can feel the kind of promulgation power of these memes, the replication power of these memes when they jump from head to head to head, and through our media system. But it's been
these little mind viruses, right?
Exactly.
It's like, I was like, I can't get it out. Yeah, it's really interesting. And once you apply them to these social media systems and these algorithms, all of a sudden they have that mass, like it's like dropping a virus on a crowded train or something like that, right? It has such a higher ability to cascade through our minds. That's
right. And there's the origin of the word going viral, right? Like the idea of something going viral is actually the process of a meme virally jumping between many, many, many humans and being successfully kind of propagated to the entirety of the population.
Yeah.
And when you take that lens to how our information flows online, it becomes a little bit weird, right? Because you realize, oh wait, I actually might be kind of the vessel for these little viruses that are jumping from brain to brain.
Yeah. We're biological systems carrying functions in our brain, and we're passing these functions to other people. It totally is a virus. So we'll come back to virality. Another definition that I might refer to is the concept of Moloch, which originated from Allen Ginsberg's poem Howl, which is a fantastic poem. I highly recommend it. And it's about why our behavior is driven by certain incentives, and this relates to the prisoner's dilemma. And why did you bring up Moloch in the book, and how does it apply to social media?
Yeah, so this is citing a really amazing post article by Scott Alexander called Meditations on Moloch, in which he basically goes through the incentive structures that cause really problematic human behavior. And you can go back in time. Moloch is this biblical god that I believe the Canaanites would sacrifice their children to, and it's been kind of this reference point in kind of religious texts and religious movements for a long time as being this kind of like this demon god. And Scott Alexander, he basically comes at it from a slightly different perspective and looking at it as a system of bad incentives that cause good people to do bad things. And many of our tools today, many of our media incentives, many of the worst kind of incentives of capitalism actually do end up creating really bad outcomes for people that are well-intentioned. And if you have the wrong incentive structure in place, then you can actually make good people do bad things. A classic example of this is the prisoner's dilemma, in which you can basically put two people in opposite rooms and give them a a certain set of incentives, they will know that they are doing the wrong thing, but they will still do the wrong thing because it is in their best interest to do the wrong thing, with worse outcomes for everyone. And that is kind of the core of Moloch, is this kind of idea that if you actually have badly designed systems, and if you have even badly emergent systems, they can cause really substantially negative outcomes for society writ large.
And it's so interesting because, like the prisoner's dilemma, they can't communicate, and that's why they can't collaborate, right?
That's right.
But you pop them into social media and you give them that communication channel, and we still struggle because people can't read each other's minds or their intentions. So it'll be interesting to drop into that as well. Thank you for that. That was a beautiful explanation. And there's one last definition I want to do before we get into social media, which is the concept of a dark valley and the dark valley of externality. What do you mean when you refer to this in the book?
So the dark valley is this concept of basically hidden harms that are present to us only well after we adopt a new technology. So every time, if you look back in history, every time we've adopted a major new technology, there is this period of mass adoption and mass consumption and mass usage of a tool in which it becomes widespread. Everyone becomes very excited about this thing. In that process of mass adoption, there are also a large number of hidden harms, as in harms that are just obscured from view. People that didn't know about these harms in advance, people just didn't understand how bad things could be. The printing press I examined pretty closely in the book, and we might go into that in a little bit. But it was this incredible invention that allowed for the dissemination of massive new quantities of information to people, but also had this cascading effect of confusion and chaos and violence that swept across the European continent and caused 100 years of civil wars as a result. And we wouldn't want to go back and change the fact that we have the printing press, but there was this dark valley of hidden harm that came in its wake. And you can look back at every major kind of media technology and see this period of chaos and confusion and disruption and damage that comes as a result of these tools that are not clear to us when we're first using them. So it's an important little valley. It's hidden because as the adoption goes up, the thriving goes down actually for a period of time until we figure it out, and then we come out the other side through some process of industry intervention, moral panic, research on harms, and eventually we make it out the other side into a better place. But many of our technologies have this dark valley.
So here we are on the other side. I don't know if we're on the other side of anything of this valley in some ways with social media. It dropped into our lives just over 2 decades ago or less. It started to proliferate, and those designs happened early on. There was all kinds of intentions, and then we went through this period of massive exponential growth, and everyone thought they were doing great. And now all of a sudden we're in that period that you're referring to of chaos, and we can see it. Everyone knows that there's something fundamentally wrong with the way that we live and communicate, but we don't know. We can't put our fingers on it. We don't know how to fix it. So let's talk about how that stage all began. And you were around Chris Cox and the early team at Facebook, and they had a vision for their platform and how it was going to change the world. And what was the difference between their vision of how Facebook was going to come and what was the actual outcome? What did they think it was going to do?
Sure. Yeah. So, the earliest days of social media, you might remember what it was like back then. It was a very heady and optimistic time. There were, incredible new opportunities for connection and building new worlds of interaction with humans across great distances. You kind of suddenly see each other, in this much more intimate way. In terms of democracy, you might remember, the Arab Spring and how powerful and meaningful that was as a time, and how Facebook and Twitter were media darlings in that moment when they were trying to. When they were rolling out and toppling dictators in the Middle East, and many of my friends that were early in tech, one of my a good friend that was one of the first engineers at Twitter. I knew a number of people that were early at Facebook, such as Cox. There was this real palpable sense of optimism and ambition and promise around these tools and what they could actually do to improve society and the world. And the media and, kind of the general messaging that we felt around that time was this great sense of optimism, real promise for what could come from these tools. And it looked like in the early days that was what was going to happen, right? It seemed like there was not these tools had nothing but upside, right? In a lot of ways, right? We felt like, oh, cool, like we have social media now. We can connect humanitarian projects. We can topple dictators. We can do all these incredible things with it. But it turns out, of course, that the truth is a bit more complex than that. And that many of these same features that we found to be really powerful and important were actually also really problematic. And that could be used by bad actors to sow discord and discontent in a way that we've come to see in recent years.
Mm. It's interesting because Facebook, you say in the book that Facebook won the social media race, early on by and one of the ways that they did that was by requiring a level of verification, and these basically what, we're going from writing letters to each other to email, where you're always still having these direct connections. Maybe you can find someone on a website and find their email and contact them, but you didn't have these like mass open social kind of town squares. That's the word I'm looking for, where you can meet new people and really kind of like expand your network socially. And then Facebook gave us this verification. You kind of had to be in some way a human being, but there's still a lot of debate around this verification standards in social media. So, but why didn't the concept of personal verification persist or translate into meaningful outcomes in the way that those Facebook founders were expecting or hoping for?
Yeah. So in the earliest days, there was this real, desire to make sure that Facebook did not turn into MySpace, right? And you might remember Friendster and MySpace. These are the early social media.
The Wild West, baby.
It was exactly, the Wild West. Exactly. Early days. And it was, those were, in many ways, Friendster resembled Facebook a lot more than MySpace resembled Facebook, but Friendster had really bad technical infrastructure, and it became too popular too fast, and it was constantly down, and so people were looking for something more. And then MySpace came along with this kind of wide open social graph. Literally everyone was within 1 degree of everyone else, because as soon as you built an account, you were connected with this guy named Tom, who was one of the founders, and so your social graph was automatically just embedded into the other into stranger social graphs, right? So, and you also didn't need to be a real person. You could make a fake account for whatever, and it exploded in popularity. It was incredibly, incredibly popular. People were on it all the time, obsessed with it, and people kind of forget how popular and incredible MySpace was in that moment. It was this huge cultural phenomenon, but with no constraints in verified users, with no constraints in terms of connections, like real connections. And also, it's funny enough, there was this bug on the site that allowed for anyone to build a profile and inject CSS code into the back end of or to the front end of the site, so that they could basically make their profile picture look like anything, or the profile page look like anything. So you ended up with this kind of garish carnival-like environment in which there's just crazy design. There was no consistency in fonts, and people put giant pictures and videos in the background, and it was just like a mess, an absolute mess after
but we were all learning how to code.
That's right.
We were all learning.
Right. Yeah.
It was awesome.
Many people's first introduction to coding was in breaking MySpace. That's right. And so it, not having that kind of core functional verification and unified filter in how people engaged with the site and how people came into the site actually caused it to be it was basically its downfall. It caused it to be to become almost unusable, because there was so much information and there was not integrity between real social connections on the site as well. So when Facebook came along, they rolled out in this famously slow way in which they required a university email address to use it, which basically ensured that it was real, like that you were a real user, first of all, and that you were a high quality user because you started in Ivy League schools. So when they first started out, it was a real hot item to have a Facebook account. It was like, oh wow, yeah, you have a Facebook account. Oh my gosh, when are they coming to my school, right? And people felt kind of obsessed with this idea of like, oh well, I'm going to get this thing, and once I get it, it's going to be this kind of
very exclusive,
exclusive item for me. And that was a really smart rollout strategy. It was just very very careful and methodical in how they rolled it out across different schools. And they didn't scale faster than they could handle in terms of the bandwidth and the technical infrastructure. And it was years before it was open to the wider audience of your average human that wanted to get on, your average adult that wasn't a college person. So the result of that was that it was a high fidelity social graph. It was actually people that tended to know each other in real life and have real connections. And Zuckerberg was, pretty ahead of the curve in noting that was going to be a really valuable asset. That real connections, real human connections, were actually more important than any connections, right? Than just having a wide open network. So that ended up being really valuable, and they just carefully built on top of feature on top of feature on top of feature in this very methodical way to try to add and test for engagement and add and test for engagement. And it was a masterclass in how to build a company steadily towards the right kind of audience in the early days, at least. So it was high integrity early on, and that was its real strength.
And then more and more people are using it, and all of a sudden the target audience for so many companies and so many kind of structures in our society are on these platforms. Our attention is there, and then with that comes certain incentive structures. And I'd love to get into the incentive structures of social media. Why is it that when you take this kind of platform, this kind of very cozy environment that you just described, where people are hanging with people they love and talking and meeting some new people and having real close connections, why does that change when you put in these incentive structures that businesses encounter? Why does extreme and accurate and inflammatory information enter into those cozy environments?
So starting in 2009, there was a set of 3 different features that were launched. And they were launched both by Twitter and by Facebook separately at different times, that did fundamentally shift this kind of this place for friends and turn it into a place for sharing information actively, and sharing news and sharing media and sharing ideas and most importantly sharing opinions. And so the first feature was the algorithmic feed. So it's the ability to rank order content based on an algorithm. So having a feed that isn't just reverse chronological, it's a feed that we are all familiar with, that is ranked for engagement and for meaningful social interactions, specifically at Facebook. I came up with this algorithm for basically determining how likely you were to find a piece of content valuable, and they called it meaningful social interactions, MSI. For short, and it was a very successful algorithm in just rank ordering content and determining, you don't want your important friends post to get lost amongst the baby pictures or the banal, kind of garbage posts of your friends. So having a ranking algorithm makes a lot of sense. We produced suddenly too much information on these platforms, so they needed a way of rank ordering that content. But it turns out that a certain type of content tended to stick to the top of our feeds more than other types, which was morally outraged content. So the type of content that makes us angry, if I'm fighting with someone about something, that actually hits a lot of those check marks for what the algorithm was looking for in terms of importance, in terms of MSI, in terms of meaningful social interaction. So if my friends are angry about something and arguing about something publicly, or arguing with a stranger publicly, then that seems like actually an important object that should be stuck to the top of the feed that you should see first. And so when that was rolled out, that was one step in this process of kind of increasing the temperature on these platforms and making them more kind of contagious to outrage and more strangely emotional than they were before. The next feature, and I'm not saying these in order because they were rolled out in different orders across both Facebook and Twitter, but Facebook and Twitter kind of ended up in this interesting game in which Twitter would launch a feature and then Facebook would copy it. And then Twitter started a feature and Facebook would copy it. And so there was, Facebook has been a great kind of thief of good ideas, right? Shameless thief of good ideas. Yeah, exactly. if they can't, if they can't build it themselves, then they'll buy the company, which is what happened with Instagram as well, right? So the next feature, which is something that we're all familiar with, is the rollout of social metrics, which is the visible likes, the visible follows, the visible shares that are all that are attached to each one of our comments. And suddenly having these numbers attached to our content did strange thing. Justin Rosenstein, who is the creator of the like button, he famously said, "I wanted to make positivity the path of least resistance," which, that sounds great on the surface. Like, it's a good signal for developers. A thumbs up is better for me. It's cheap for me to give, but it's very meaningful to receive from a friend, right? It's a great signal for determining what you actually like versus what you're actually watching. So it's more, it's egalitarian. It's a way that you don't need to rely on gatekeepers to determine what people are actually liking. You can actually just see what the, like voting, you can see how your friends are voting for the good content that's in the system. And that was really valuable. But it turns out that did something very strange to us, which is that it actually started to train us to post content and to rate content in this competitive, strange new social environment. So there's a famous set of experiments back in the 1930s by B.F. Skinner, in which he took rodents and he put them into boxes and he flashed a light. And there's a paddle, a little button that the rodents could press when the light flashed. And if the light flashed and the rodents pressed the button, they would receive a food pellet. So he was training these rodents. So light flashes, food buttons pressed, food pellet comes out. He was training these rodents to actually to press these buttons. But what he found was that if the rodents consistently got rewards each time they pressed the button and the light flash, or the light flash and they pressed the button, if they got consistent rewards from that, the rodents would get sated and they would kind of bored and they'd stop pressing that button. They'd be like, that's cool. I know I can get the food when I'm hungry. But if you added a randomness, if you actually added some level of kind of inconsistency in how often the button produced the food, the rodents went a little bit insane. They actually went kind of crazy and got obsessed with the process of pressing the button to get the food. They would try to figure out the pattern. And it turns out, this is called an operant conditioning chamber. And it turns out that humans, all mammals, many animals, birds even, that we have this programming responding very strongly to intermittent variable rewards, which is rewards that have a slightly random payout to them, cause us to become obsessed with them. And there's an industry that has done this very well in the past, that figured this out before social media, which is you can put people in a giant room, fill it with slot machines, with more like flashing lights, and you press a single button. That's the only thing they do, and they will spend fortunes and spend days of their life, and they're just trying to press the button. And it makes sense in an evolutionary sense for us to do that. We're looking for pattern matching. For our ancestors trying to find berries in a forest. If you find some berries in one bush, but you don't find them in the other bush, and you still want to keep looking for the pattern, try to figure out what it is, where I can actually find these berries. And so there's an evolutionary foundation to that. But it turns out when you put likes on our comments or on our posts, then it actually trains us in much the same way, because we post something and there's this sudden flood of metrics that come to us, or they don't. And that randomness is very addictive for us. And it's also bathed in this social this social confirmation from our friends. So it actually causes us to be even more attentive to what we're posting. It's like this is incredibly addictive product of posting amongst our friends and becoming obsessed with the return.
And I think this principle also applies to the way that we consume media, because you're just like, all right, I'm just gonna keep scrolling until I find that one post that makes me feel good. I breathed heavily out my nose at this meme, that wasn't quite a laugh, right? And then it's like, all of a sudden, like you said, you've been down that hole for 40 minutes and you're like, where the hell am I? What corner of the internet am I in? Where am I? It's a fascinating thing to experience. We all go through it now with our social media.
That's right. And then the final feature set that was rolled out was the single click share, which is the ability to click a button and share with all of your social graph. So Twitter did this in the form of the retweet initially, which famously by one of the engineers that designed it felt like when he designed it, he said, I think we're handing a loaded gun to a 5-year-old. And which when he rolled that, he's like, I don't think that this is actually going to be a good thing. I think this is actually going to be a problem. That it turned out to be, I think, fairly accurate in terms of our ability to spread information virally to our friends across our social graphs. That single click share, which was rolled out at Twitter and then at Facebook a few years later, it just dramatically changed the speed and spread of viral information in our networks. It totally upended our ability to make sense of the world, because it increased the velocity of information so dramatically.
So let's talk about those viral those viral events, and I want to start with clickbait. And you said clickbait is a viral scourge that facilitated the race to the bottom of the internet. So I know how you feel about it. There was actually one concept that really fascinated me. You talked about scissor splitting ideas.
Scissor statements, yeah.
Scissor statements, right. And they're perfectly calibrated to divide groups to maximize engagement. And we've seen this where there's a video of someone speaking and maybe it's political, and it seems like 100% of the people who stand for that statement will share the video, and 100% of the people who stand against that statement will share the video, so they can make their points about it, right? And it's perfectly dividing those groups, and you can only tell the difference between those groups by what they're saying about the video. Like, this is the best thing ever, this is the worst thing ever.
Right.
And the same goes for clickbait. We have these mechanisms like A/B testing and effective engagement testing. Tell us a little bit about what those mechanisms do to the way that we engage with media / don't engage with media, as in actually read the articles or whatever it is.
Yeah, totally. So these 3 changes that happened to our media landscape, our social media landscape, they didn't just stay on social media. They actually ended up transiting to traditional media in a very big way. Media entrepreneurs saw that there were eyeballs on social media, and many more eyeballs on social media than were on traditional media. And so they started making media for social media specifically. And so you can think about these changes as sort of like a change to the physical landscape of our media environment, right? It's actually like a change to the physical landscape. It made, certain new highways available to people to traverse that old guard media was not really traversing, right, that much. So yeah, a few of these innovations came from the tools of A/B testing and optimization, which is basically the process of taking multiple different headlines from a particular article or a piece of content, whatever content that is, video or anything, and split testing it and running it against an audience. So you write, this is the classic Upworthy example / BuzzFeed example, because they both kind of innovated in this space around the same time, which you take, you write 25 different versions of a headline for a piece of content, and then you test which one of those 25 pieces of content or a headline, which one of those 25 headlines will actually receive the most engagement. And what happened was that you found these very strange sort of new emotional trigger statements attached to every single headline, which is, you'll be shocked to see, X crushes Y. This gives you goosebumps. And this is around, 2016, 2017, where this really came to a head. This is like the listicle time frame, also the internet, in which it felt, it's like
the result will shock you.
Exactly.
All that.
Which is a very very interesting moment for I think our collective consciousness on the internet, because everyone was suddenly assaulted by this stuff. It was like we suddenly had this new viral vulnerability that we were all, none of us knew how to respond to. It was, talking about memes again. It's like these were memes that we didn't have defenses for. So everyone clicked on them. Everyone, got outraged by them and overwhelmed by them for a short period.
And real quick for the audience, that is that A/B testing system that Tobias just mentioned is evolutionary theory right there, where you're taking, it's basically exactly how survival of the fittest works, and they're running it through these algorithms just for this one title of this one article, and then whatever it's basically what is the least shitty title for that article that will get the most
Right.
in terms of that will get the most viewers. At least that's how I refer to evolution is
Totally. Yeah.
survival of the least
How can we
shit.
make this particular
Yeah.
this particular piece of content most memetically viral? How can we make it? How
Yeah.
can we select for the best, the most successful version of this meme, and how it transits.
Mm.
And it it's very, very interesting to look at how, and you can watch this kind of steady stream of these various trends explode across the internet, and then you can watch also culturally us develop kind of antibodies to some of these memes. Be like, oh wait, no, I won't be shocked to see what that actually says at the end. This listicle is garbage, right? And so we actually slowly began to develop these kind of cognitive antibodies to these mimetic, some of the worst ones, right? And we're still prone to a lot of them, but some of the worst ones we began to develop some
The most obvious
antibodies
ones we've developed at least a little bit of resistance.
Yeah,
it
totally.
seems.
And what I will say is that one of the ones that we have not yet really developed proper resistance to, I think, and I'm hoping this changes, but in recent years, we're still very, very prone to responding to outrageous headlines, and headlines that are morally and emotionally condemning and problematic, and that speak to our moral foundations in a very a very problematic way. So we do find ourselves, especially when it's hating on the political party opposite of us, and whatever kind of identity group that we're in, and the opposition group, we still respond very, very strongly to these, and we have not yet developed proper cultural antibodies, cognitive antibodies to them.
Okay, well, let's get into that. Let's talk about the negative Moloch-based incentive structures that now exist in journalism. So what led to the mass loss of faith in journalistic systems? How did social media break the news?
Yeah, totally. Yeah, so, we all grew up, I think, in a, news-based environment that tended to privilege facts over falsehoods, and that tended to, it felt very trustworthy historically. You grew up with Dan Rather on TV, or Walter Cronkite, or some of these old gray anchors that you're like, oh, that guy, he's telling the truth, and there's this media enterprise behind him that has our best interest in mind, right? The New York Times, these kind of old guard journalistic enterprises that really did have our best interests in mind collectively. And so the problem is, and I think we realized this growing up, I certainly didn't, was that these are businesses that require attention in order to sell advertising to operate, and or subscriptions also, but advertising is a big portion of that. And so if they're not getting the attention that allows for them to continue, then they will die. And if they don't die, they will actually become desperate and try to capture our attention in other ways. And that is a unfortunate truth that if a news organization is really struggling economically, then they will start to bend their coverage to try to attract more readers and more viewers, and more just more advertising revenue as a way to survive. And so historically, these media enterprises were so profitable, and they were extremely profitable, that they did not need to worry about that nearly as much. There was a lot more kind of neutrality in reporting, and a lot of more ease in the editorial lens, and not as much competitive pressure for them to exist in this evolutionary landscape, right? Mm-hmm. But all of a sudden with social media, there was huge competitive pressure, right? They actually began to kind of suffer and struggle. So a lot of news organizations began to shift their coverage. And I was during 2016, I was working as a consultant for one of the nation's largest news organizations, while simultaneously doing A/B testing on Facebook for another company. And I was watching this very strange thing happen, where it was like, oh, cool. Like, I can see how this new guard media, these like new media enterprises, are just eating the lunch of this traditional news organization. I could watch the traditional news organization make really terrible editorial decisions and really terrible advertising decisions in order to try to stay alive during that time. And so I watched some really, I wouldn't call it shady, but I would call it very low quality decisions that were being made at this old,
Right.
very trusted centrist news organization that would, reach like 100 million, or it was like 100 million Americans over the course of, on a monthly basis. And they were dying. They were getting slaughtered by Facebook. And as a result, they actually started changing their editorial tenor and started cutting news staff, started cutting, cutting fact checking, all of these things that were really important for sense making in a society. I watched them actually change their coverage, and that was really disheartening and scary, because what was being replaced by was basically clickbait, right, during that moment. So that's not a great trade. That's not a great trade-off ultimately for our attention. We don't, we require good journalists and we require good reporting, and to watch that happen in real time was really scary.
And you refer to a few things that journalistic enterprises started to do, things like using selective facts to cater to attention, basically doing their self-selection internally, being like, let's ignore that because that's boring and blah, blah, blah. And then there's also, you referred to groupthink, saving costs by reporting what other outlets are reporting, and, basically being like, okay, well, the Atlantic reported it, so I'm going to report it, and then someone else does, and we have to spin out, right?
Yeah.
And then also pandering to in sponsored media and creating, basically creating media based off of how they have their incentive structures built internally financially.
Right. Yeah, and there's this other thing that I think is really strange and interesting that happened, which was that, and I don't think most people know how fundamentally journalism has turned inside out as a result of social media. But one of the cheapest and easiest ways to get clicks on a story as a journalist, or as a newspaper, or as a media company, is to look for what's trending online and make a story about that. And if you think about the incentives for things to go viral and this kind of broader media landscape that we're a part of right now, so you can just go onto Twitter and see what people are angry about, and you can write a story about that, and with the headline, "People are angry about X" on Twitter. Well, I guess you have to say X now. So people are angry about X on X, but people are angry about something on X. And that headline itself will become, that's like automatic guaranteed traffic, because people, like, even if it's a tiny number of people that are actually angry about that particular thing, that becomes a guaranteed way to get clicks, because the people that are angry that people are angry about it will click on it and be like, why are people angry about this? And so any kind of small infraction or small cultural issue can become a story, highly trafficked story. An outraged story, for instance, which becomes this significant signal processing issue for us, because what we're seeing a lot of the time in traditional media that is relying on social media is these tiny infraction points in society becoming much, much larger issues than they really are. So, and when we see some small threat or some small conflict become much larger than it is in real life, then we assume that the world is going a little bit crazy, right? We're like, how is it possible that all these people are angry about this absurd thing? And the reality is, not that many people are actually angry about this absurd small thing. It's not the case. You're just getting you're getting this overexposure to this one small thing, because it actually generates outrage and engagement.
All right, here's what we're going to do. I'm going to create a clip from this exact part of our conversation, and I'm going to title it "Why People Are Angry About Journalism," and I'm going to give it like a really thought, kind of inflaming title card image.
Right.
All right. And all right, if you're watching this right now on social media and you came here because of the algorithm, congratulations. We did our job.
Nice.
All right. We're going to try that. So, and then there's another two things that you refer to, which is context creep and context collapse, and how those relate to journalism. What are those two things? What are those two results that we see in terms of like truth and trying to like actually report on truth in terms of the social media era?
Yeah, totally. So, when we push real life into any box of text, whether it's a traditional news story, or if it's a character delimited tweet, we are actually changing that event, and we are we're pushing it into a smaller container that is not fully representative of the real world. So on Twitter, unfortunately, and on Facebook as well, this historically has, and Instagram is this also on a regular basis. You strip out a lot of the nuance and the context and the richness of that actual event. And, life on its own is quite messy, right? Life is full of ambiguous, weird things that happen on a regular basis. But when you push it into social media, you end up removing a lot of the real important richness and deeper information, deeper context that was present in that event. So a great example of this was the what year was this? Is, I believe, 2019, when there were the 2019 protests in Washington. Covington Catholic. Yeah, exactly. When there was a group of kids from Covington Catholic school who were Trump supporters that were at a rally, and there was this clip that circulated on social media of these kids basically doing a chant in front of a Native American man. And that went wildly viral. And, if you look at it from a particular angle, it looks bad. It looks really bad, right? You watch this video for just a 60-second clip, and you're like, oh my gosh, these kids are horrible. They're just like taunting this poor old Native American man. But it turns out in the actual play-by-play of that moment, the Native American man walked into this conflict between this shouting match that happened. These kids were there at a school rally, or they were there with their school for a rally, a political rally, and they were all Republican kids. But there was
even in post interviews, they said we just bought the Trump hats because we thought it would be funny. It's like what a couple of them had said. So they're all wearing Trump hats, right, for one reason or another.
Right. So and they were shouted at by another group of protesters in the moments leading up to that. So there's this like altercation between two different groups of protesters that were happening right there. I think there were the Black Israelites or something like that. I forget the actual name of the other group that was there, but it was this, one of these weird moments that happens at a protest when there's just people doing weird stuff, right? People yell at each other. People are really heated. They do funny, strange things. And, reality is very forgiving. And, in real life, like people actually are not likely to do terrible things to one another most of the time in real life, right? And that resolved fine. It wasn't actually an issue. But this one clip of these kids chanting in front of this Native American man, and there's particularly this one kid that's basically just smiling and glaring at the Native American man. After the Native American man came up to him, Nathan Phillips, I believe was his name, he came up to this group and was like banging on his drum in front of this, and the kids just like smiling and staring at him. It's like a smirk. It's like it's like kind of like a pregnant kind of like smirk at this guy. And if you see just that clip, with no other context about what happened before, you find it like weird and kind of awkward and strange. But what happens next? So that's context collapse, when there's no other context for actually what's happening in that moment. It's been stripped away, so you only see this one tiny little kind of still frame from this broader film of life,
causing a violent reaction. By the way, so there's people like trying to we want their names, we want their addresses,
totally
hunt these kids down.
Absolutely.
It was crazy. What people were doing online,
and that was a result of context creep, which is what other people could see that clip. They could tap into their own emotional outrage based on the reaction and their interpretation of that clip, and add context on top of it, being like, this is an example of Trump's America, where this neo-Nazi kid can go out there and just have this terrible look on his face and look at this poor Native American man, and so people were adding this additional context on top of the actual event itself without really knowing what was going on. And those tweets went further viral, and people kept on adding on their own kind of disgusted and outraged takes on top of it. And once enough people are angry about something, right, there's this knock-on effect in which there's the scissor statement, right, which is where people see it in one way and they're like, oh, this you're right, this is a horrible example of what's wrong with society. and people pile on. It becomes kind of the shibboleth in which other people are like, oh yeah, you know what, absolutely, this is horrible, it was horrific, I cannot believe they did that. And it's a forcing function for other people to pick sides on that topic too. So if it becomes enough of an issue, then everyone will need to have an opinion about this thing that was, has been so divorced from the primary event ultimately.
Yep.
And that's really problematic. That's really not good for our society. And again, reality is actually very forgiving, right? Everyone walked away from that event fine, right? Like no one had emotional scarring from it in the moment. It was this strange machine that we plugged that event into and turned it into this grotesque exaggeration of what it was. And the result was this very just horrible outcome for everyone observing it, right? So much outrage and so much sadness and so much hand-wringing and disgust and frustration about what this represented. And the truth is, it didn't represent anything. It really didn't. And that's
just a chaotic moment. It's like the dress that you mentioned in the book.
Yeah.
That's blue or gold, and everyone sees it differently, and just causes chaos because everyone's like, the whole system collapses into left or right. Right.
Yeah. The dress is a great example. The dress is, I think, a perfect example of this. So the dress is a concrete example of a scissor statement, right? Which is something that is inherently ambiguous. So it's actually very difficult. Like you can't get a consensus amongst the general population about whether or not the dress is black and blue or white and gold, right? You can't actually get a consensus because of the way that our eyes are wired, the ways that our brain is wired. Like we have different brains, and our brains observe colors in slightly different ways. And the result was this thing that was inherently ambiguous, but that created tremendous confidence, that inspired deep confidence in people's perceptions. And that is what scissor statements do. They are strong statements that push us into opposing groups on a particular issue instantaneously and automatically. And that is what social media is fantastic at generating and serving us on a regular basis.
So let's talk a little bit about free speech, the easiest of all the things for us to discuss today, and minority opinions specifically. Minority opinions are, you dedicate a really interesting part of your book about it. You talk a lot about COVID-19. You talk about the WhatsApp group that you ended up moderating and had to deal with really volatile minority opinions that ended up causing issues, not only throughout your WhatsApp group, but throughout society. And social media spurs these kinds of opinions forward because of just the way they're structured, the way they tap into our limbic systems, if you will. How do we, was John Stuart Mill, you refer to him, was he correct? Should we allow any ideology, any speech to pass through all standards of verification? Are we giving is it okay to give platforms to toxic ideology? Or is there any kind of, is there any standard here that we should hold to the way that we do free speech in the social media era?
Yeah, so we really are at this crisis point in terms of free speech, because the way that the modern media system of including social media has been set up is very dangerous to a functioning society. And what I mean by that is that historically we've had gatekeepers that were responsible for making sure that certain types of information were disseminated to the larger public, right? And free speech is this really important piece of that, right? Like there's a reason why we have the First Amendment, that the process of our claims impacting another person's claim, and when I make a claim and you can refute that claim, my claim gets better if it's done in good faith, right? That is the point of freedom of speech, is actually having these points of concrete exchange when I'm called out on the issues related to my initial belief, because we are wrong before we are right, and that is part of our species. But we have the superpower, which is the ability to see the flaws in other people's arguments better than we can see the flaws in our own arguments. So the point of freedom of speech is allowing for many people to refute the claims of other people writ large. And that, J.S. Mill, historically, he's said that, you're robbing society writ large of the ability to refute and understand the problems in an idea if you are shutting down speech. And that's very kind of core to the American system of media dissemination. I think what's missing in a piece of this debate is the recognition that someone somewhere is always making a determination as to what people can say and see. What I mean by that is that if you go out to the founding of the Republic, there was always someone involved in the dissemination and propagation of a piece of information, whether it's a newspaper editor, whether or not it's someone at a radio station that was determining what could actually be platformed, what couldn't. And for a large portion of our history, it was actually also the federal government, in contrast to some of the portions of the First Amendment that we would consider sacred today, right? And that we've gone so far on this kind of free speech absolutism these days that we look back at, there were censors on television, radio stations, right? Deciding what shows could and could not be on the air in the 80s and 90s, right? And I'm not saying that was good, but I'm just saying that we've always had someone that's been responsible for determining what can and cannot be seen and said in society. And we still do. And that's what I want to note here, is that even if we, think we're living in this kind of golden age of free speech to some degree, we have just transited and passed off those responsibilities largely to algorithms. So the people that used to be responsible for determining what could be said are now actually algorithms that are responsible for what can and cannot be amplified, and what is and is not being amplified. And so I think it's much more important to think about social media companies like traditional media companies, because they are actually selectively determining what it is, much of the time, what it is we're actually seeing and being exposed to on a regular basis. So, the day that Facebook and Twitter stopped reverse chronologically rank ordering their content and started instead doing algorithmic rank ordering, they were actually making strong editorial decisions for a much larger audience than historical newspapers and radio stations and TV stations were actually making, right? They're actually making really powerful editorial decisions, but they're not treated like media companies because of Section 230, which is Communication Decency Act in the 1990s that dictates how we regulate information online.
It's so fascinating to think about, those forms of censorship or information regulation before algorithms was human, right? And because it was human, it was a part of our culture. In one way or another, it was a culturally based algorithm. And then when you add in this automatic algorithm that you referred to, the technical Facebook or Instagram algorithm that evolves instantaneously to always maximize one thing, the amount of attention that the maximum amount of users are paying attention to the app, right? To keep that one thing that is always an N of one in our lives, which is what we're paying attention to at any given moment, and maximizing that. That algorithm is now what is controlling the decision-making process. And it's fascinating. And you mentioned, and this really, free speech relates heavily to it, the way that our democracy was formed, right? Which it is incredible. I love the way you described it. It's one of my favorite parts of your book, referring to the democracy as almost a self-correcting code that evolves over time, and it changes, and it does have a lot of issues, obviously, and then also it does have self-corrections. It self-corrected to empower disenfranchised groups that weren't included, But why isn't this code now strong enough or fast enough to withstand and survive in the current information system from your perspective?
Yeah. So the reason I try to take this very macroscopic view of democratic systems as being, self-correcting systems that we all, come to rely upon to help us organize in society. But in a way, they're giant machines. Democracies are giant machines that we have built in society, and we've built them. They run on, they run on humans. The code runs on humans, right. But they're big programs that we build to organize our society, and they do something very specific. They help us take problems, take like outrages we see in the world, the issues that we're facing in the world, and turn them into legislation, right? So legislation to actually solve those problems. Does that make sense? So we basically we take issues that we see collectively, and through this process of of voting and stewardship of people's resources, we actually try to allocate those resources to solving problems through representation in our government. And so that's a really important frame, I think, for thinking about democracy, because the core of it then is information based, is like how we actually are consuming information and seeing the problems that we're exposed to, and how we're organizing around those problems. So, Thomas Jefferson famously said that he preferred newspapers to government, and he thought that if you just gave people newspapers, that was good enough for them to organize around problems. Newspapers report on a problem, they would people would get outraged, and they would collectively come together to solve the problem themselves. And they didn't really need government to do that. They could just do small New England style councils and just solve the problem themselves. They didn't need government to do that, right? So it turns out that the actual media that we use to determine what the problems are becomes then the most critical piece of that process, right? Like how we observe the outrages in society, how the inputs to the code, essentially. How we see the speed of outrage, the quantity of outrage, and then how we respond to it is really, really important. Funnily enough, when Jefferson got into the presidency, he actually did a complete 180 on that perspective and tried to outright ban some newspapers for reporting on him so terribly as a president during that time. So he actually, it was a funny about face in terms of his steadfast adherence to the First Amendment. But yeah, the media system has always had flaws, but it is kind of this funny paradox of democracy that the idea of free speech and the idea of free information flows is both core to the democratic process, but it's also it's one of its greatest weaknesses too, because if people get angry about the wrong things, and if they get so upset at the system itself, and they if they get too outraged too quickly, and get so upset with the system itself, then they can undermine the system itself. And this is the problem with populists and demagogues historically. With kind of every major democracy that's failed in the past has come down to people getting angry that the system was not working for them, and then voting into power someone that an authoritarian that basically strips the system of its democratic foundations. And so that is one of the core problems with democracy. And so if you think about it in terms of information system that is running on human code, and the inputs are the media information that we're consuming on a regular basis, like the issues that we're seeing, that we're being fed. Because I, as myself, I have this very limited kind of sphere of visibility into the problems of the world. I rely upon proxies. I rely upon other people to tell me what is wrong with the world. And historically, those people were journalists. It might be some of my friends, it might be a smart friend that I have somewhere. But I have a very limited purview into what is actually going on in my world. So we all rely upon these proxies to tell us what is actually going on, and what are real problems and what are false problems. And so this is one of the core problems with misinformation, and particularly outraged misinformation that's attached to some kind of moral issue, is that if we get exposed to things that are not actually problems, right? And we think that things are wrong that are not actually wrong, then we will solve for the wrong problem. We will actually, we'll vote people in the office who will legislate and allocate resources to solving the wrong problem. And so democracies are so intensely dependent upon good information flows that when they fail, when they start to get into these unstable states, when there's too much viral misinformation, democracies are actually really, really fragile in those times. And we are in one of those moments right now, particularly with social media, because we have this very unstable system of amplified mis and disinformation with very few guardrails in how the structure is built, and it's not operating at all like the more stable system that was available to us for the last 100+ years. It's operating much more like a viral network than a knowledge network. I can speak to that in a moment, but I think it's really important to note that democracies are dependent upon good information, and if it has bad information, as in false information, then democracies don't function. They actually stop working. Period.
Right. Yeah, you mentioned a great point in the book that our democracy was built when information moved at about 55 miles an hour, which is the speed of a person on a horse. And, if you're going to move at that speed, then the information has a lot of time to be verified it needs to be verified or to kind of make that distance. And instead of that, now we have speed of light, information that's happening all over. And, the system, this ancient almost system of self-correcting code that we created isn't holding up to that level of speed, it seems.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And there are these interesting corollaries between speed and accuracy, right? But actually, the faster information that we get is usually like our first take is usually wrong. You know what I mean? Like if you look at how information transits, and there's this inherent tension for all journalists always, which is you want to be first, but you also don't want to be wrong, and that is a core kind of tenet of journalism, which is that if you're wrong, you're not first, right? If you actually got it wrong, then you're not. Then you haven't actually won. You've actually failed. So there's this inherent tension with new information that we receive, and one of the big handoffs that happened with the internet and with social media was that the traditional job of journalists, which was a profession that was perfected over the course of 100 years, that involved a whole bunch of checks and balances and processes of verification and corroboration and citation, that has been handed off to us as individuals, and we have no idea what a journalist does. Like, we don't know what they actually do in order to verify and cite good information, good sources when they're actually sharing information onward. And that has not been shared widely, that this is all our responsibility now largely. And we are not prepared in our current form, at least, to be good stewards of our information flows.
So let's get into the next form. Like, let's talk about, okay, the type 1 planet model. How do we exist for thousands of years in using the technology that we have now, assuming future technologies? And a question I had for you is, it's kind of like the Lord of the Rings metaphor, the Ring of Power, right? There's so many people that try to use the Ring of Power for good, right? Boromir is famous for saying we could use this, and it's clear that the Ring of Power could never be used for anything other than evil. And so I wanted to ask you, is social media a Ring of Power? Is it like a tool of of Moloch, if we're going to go deep into these all these fun names and mythologies? Or is it something that can be adapted to better fit the way that our civilization needs it to exist?
So if the question is whether or not social media is kind of this inherently problematic force that is going to poison society indefinitely, I think that's an interesting question. I don't think it is. I think it has tremendous power to actually do good things in the world. And I don't think it is the failure mode of society unless we let it be, right? I think that, every major technology goes through, as we talked about, this period of a dark valley in which we learn that it's not as good as we thought, and that there's a lot of inherent problems that come from these tools being deployed across the world. So, I think that social media has great promise, and I think that if we make a couple of key changes to how it works, we can really utilize its powers without needing to fling it into non-doom, so to speak. Yeah.
Cool. So let's talk about those you said cultural antibodies earlier, and I loved that phrase. So how do we build more cultural antibodies and regulations, coordinations to keep Moloch at bay, that kind of stuff?
Yeah. So I think that most of it comes down to actual design changes at the company level. I think that, there's a lot we can do both as individuals. There's a lot we can do as governments. But I think the highest leverage changes do come from the design angle for these tools. Now, I can speak to a couple of the kind of individual things that we can do, the first, which I think is helpful, and then I can go into the platform and then governmental side of things. So as individuals, I think it's really important to recognize that we are stewards of our communities online. We are actually stewards of how our friends see the world. And so it's actually up to us. It really is up to us to be very careful with what we share. What I do on a regular basis is I actually have a pretty substantial set of filters and content blockers that help me reduce my exposure to highly emotionally intense information on a regular basis. And what I mean by that is, like, I'm inherently a news junkie. I love new information, and my brain constantly defaults to like NewYorkTimes.com or just constantly going to the newsreader. It's like wants this new information. And I've had to recognize in myself that that is not necessary. I do not need to have a constant stream of updates from the world. It's actually not necessary for me to have a happy and healthy life and contribute to society. And so particularly on social media, I use a content blocker called 1sec, which is great. It's basically a content friction point. It causes me to take a deep breath before I enter in to the kind of automatic typing of the app, or I'll type in the app, or I'll pull it up on my phone, and it takes like 5 minutes to set up on your phone. It takes 2 minutes to set up on your browser, and it just forces you to take a deep breath and make sure that you're not impulsively tapping into the matrix, right? You're actually just taking it. You're like, okay, wait, why am I doing this? I don't need to do this right now. And it has saved me, it saves me hours and hours a week on a regular basis. So I think that reducing our exposure to triggers like that is actually really important, because our brains will default to trying to find that new information. Historically, for our ancestors, new information was like as rare as sugar. And so it's kind of a similar thing. Like, new information is very, very, it's hardwired into us. We want new information. So recognizing that's kind of like a sugar addiction, right? And like, okay, cool, I can take a breath when I'm walking into these tools is really important. Also recognizing that the newest stuff that you see online, like the fastest spreading information, is less likely to be true. It's actually less likely to be accurate. Like, the longer you have for information to exist, the longer people have to verify its accuracy. And you saw a bunch of this quite recently with the terrorist attacks in Israel, where a whole bunch of the stuff that you saw on spreading on X was actually false. The earliest stuff was false. It was quite horrific, no doubt. Like the many, many horrific things that were present that were actually not part of some of that initial reporting as well. So, but the fastest information tends to be less accurate, more emotional, and more lacking context. So really important to just recognize that, like, you don't need to participate in the spectacle in order to be well informed. If you get your news a day after it happens, you're actually much more likely to get good information than if you get it the exact moment that it happens. Even though that urgency is present for us, and we want to be first, and we want to share that with our friends, and we want to talk about it with our friends. But that is not actually a great way to sense make in the world. Like, the longer we have to for people to verify, corroborate, check claims, that is actually the better way of recognizing good information. So that's like one cultural antibody that I think we really do need to start to absorb, right?
And I'll have you email me all the other tools that you use or anything like that, and I'll include them in the show notes.
Great.
For people to check out.
Awesome.
That's
perfect.
Great.
Yeah. So on the government side, there's actually a good piece of legislation that's working its way through Congress right now called the Platform Accountability and Transparency Act, PATA, which is an effort by a bunch of academics and civil society to basically make the harms of social media platforms visible to the wider world. So there are these, it's basically a set of regulations that would make it mandatory for social media companies to share some of the algorithmic outputs of their tools, right? The same way that their researchers were able to jump into Twitter and do a lot of research in the last 5 years or so. They couldn't really do that on Facebook. There was a couple of small groups that were able to access Facebook's data, but most companies were not able to access the actual harms of what these algorithms are producing and who is saying what and what is getting spread far and wide. And so actually having access and having a government mandate to get access to the some of the transparent, some of the APIs on the back end and what is actually happening would go a long way. And, I think these platforms are actually quite against that in general because they know that it's a major liability for them. But that is the kind of regulation that we need that would actually, I think, make a huge difference because it would force these companies to try to reduce their harms because they know they're going to be visible. Because historically they have not been visible; they've actually been largely cut off from public view. Where a lot of the worst stuff that has happened is not visible to us because social media is so opaque, and these companies are sitting on such large quantities of data that they're not sharing with the world. I understand from a business perspective why they would not want to do that, but that is one of these moments where in order to keep Moloch at bay, we need government regulation that allows for these harms to be actually more visible to the rest of us, and that would actually change the incentives internally at these companies to reduce some of those harms. And so then at the platform level, there's actually a whole bunch of design incentives and changes that we can make that I think would dramatically improve these tools. Particularly when it comes to content verification and content management, one of the biggest issues with the last 4 or 5 years of content management online is that a lot of these content decisions about what we see and don't see come from top down, right? A lot of these companies are making calls as to what we can and cannot see on these platforms. You have a whole bunch of content moderators that are flagging stuff for being offensive, for being politically motivated, for being problematic or untrue. And each one of those demotions or takedowns that happens in kind of a gray area that maybe was accurate or maybe wasn't totally accurate, and just any one of those kind of this happened a lot around COVID information or COVID misinformation at the time. When that happens and they're wrong, when it's like a top down content decision, there's this explosion of outrage that comes around that, because people are like, I am being censored, and there's this feeling of frustration and desperation and anguish and anger and outrage at the fact that they were saying something that they feel is important, that's protecting their community and trying to improve the world, and they have been actually just shut down by this faceless algorithm that they have no recourse against. And I think that's not the best way to do this. I think we need better bottom-up tools of verification. There are some tools that are already being deployed, some like zygotes of these tools. Are basically bottom-up fact-checking tools that are embedded in the way that these tools are, the way that social media is designed. So X has this feature called Community Notes, which I think is a fantastic fact-checking feature. It's community-driven fact-checking, which allows for a whole bunch of people to enter in. You can enroll in the Community Notes program, and basically you act as sort of like a Wikipedia-style moderator of what it is of an accurate piece of information. You can call it out. It's like they have a whole range of things that you can call out. It's like, is this well cited? Is this coming from a primary source? Is this something that is taking something out of context? And you can offer up your individual commentary. And it's not the same thing as basically like snitching on someone for doing something against the rules. It's actually it's offering up an alternate perspective and encouraging other users to be more accurate in their claims. So, everyone from Biden to the Ayatollah in Iran to Elon Musk has been community noted. And each one of those tends to actually improve our sense making around those viral tweets. And so for the most viral content, as is going viral, the ability to community note this stuff and make it more accurate in real time is incredibly important. I think that we desperately need more systems like that deployed across our social media platforms, because that, like, the spread of viral misinformation, again, it shouldn't be these top-down edicts around things, and people should have recourse. And I'm heartened by things like the oversight board at Facebook, which actually does go through and try to review some of these posts and try to give people recourse in that process. But really, I think that the way to solve this problem is to make social media more like Wikipedia, which is give it a functional way of claims and refutations that are designed and embedded into the code, so that we actually have, as individual users, the ability to comment and improve on the shared information that we're receiving and getting confused by and giving our own input on. I think that's a hugely important piece of the puzzle.
I love that you brought up community notes. for the shit show that X is turning into in many ways, there, it's going through an evolutionary process, and it is changing very quickly. It's become a more agile group, and they're able to kind of go through this process of iteration and failure at a much faster rate than we've seen from other social media companies. So it's going to be interesting to see where they are, even a year from now.
I'm hopeful, and not to comment too much on the current debates, but I do think that Elon does need to reprioritize these people that are focusing on mis and disinformation in these integrity teams, because there are some really, there's a huge amount of damage that can come in the meantime when a lot of these teams are not present in the company, especially in advance of 2024, and particularly when it comes to generative AI, because there's so many new opportunities coming with generative AI to confuse us widely. And so I think that if we're thinking about the issues related to AI, they almost all relate to, and I'm not saying like all of them, but almost, I think all of the most dangerous near-term issues relate to how information spreads on social media as a result of these tools. So fixing social media and making sure that we have good, verified systems of getting accurate information in a time when you can generate any image of anything or any video or any voice of anyone doing anything, that's going to be incredibly important to make sure that we have high fidelity information in a functioning democracy.
Man, I feel like we are watching a storm coming in for the next election. It is going to flex every single part of our democracy, this election. And I'm so thankful to have someone like you. I sincerely hope that I'm going to be considered super lucky to have gotten you on this show, because I can see that you're an incredible communicator. The way that you articulate these complex ideas is fantastic. The book is fantastic. And I think we need your perspectives genuinely for this upcoming election. And people need to understand what it is that's happening to their brains when they go on social media, how they can prevent it, how they can give it a day, if there's an event, and those kinds of things to correct their own behavior. And then also we got to move quickly in terms of these changes that are going to happen to the platforms ahead of this storm that's about to hit our country. It's going to be crazy. Tobias, thank you so much, man. You are amazing. I really appreciate your time today, and I hope we can stay connected in the future. It was excellent.
Thank you so much, Robert. This was awesome. Really enjoyed the conversation.